two nations with over 330 million and 85 million people, respectively control enough military power to reshape the Middle East overnight. The United States and Iran haven't spoken diplomatically in over 4 decades, yet their conflict has defined modern geopolitics. In January 2020, a single drone strike brought them within hours of a war that could have dwarfed World War II. Today, in 2025, with Iran's nuclear program advancing and tensions at a breaking point, understanding how these former allies became capable of triggering a regional war over nuclear facilities isn't just history. It's the key to predicting what happens next. This confrontation didn't emerge from nowhere. It began with a discovery that would forever alter the balance of power in the region. The oil discovery that changed everything. In 1901, British investor William Knox Darcy obtained drilling rights across 480,000 square miles of Iranian territory, leading to a discovery at Mossadegh Soleimani in May 1908 that would reshape global politics for over a century. British geologists quickly realized they had found reserves that dwarfed anything previously discovered outside the United States. Within months, additional surveys revealed that Iran possessed what would eventually be recognized as some of the world's largest petroleum deposits. The British government immediately understood the strategic implications of controlling these resources, particularly as the Royal Navy was transitioning from coal to oil-powered vessels. The formation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1909 established a framework that would become the template for resource extraction agreements throughout the developing world. The British structured the company to ensure maximum benefit for themselves while providing minimal compensation to Iran. Iran received just 16% of net profits under the 1909 oil concession, while Britain controlled every aspect of the operation from exploration and extraction to refining and marketing. Iranian authorities had no oversight of the company's financial records or operational decisions. This arrangement represented a new form of economic exploitation that achieved colonial results through agreements that appeared voluntary but were structurally unfair. Iran maintained nominal sovereignty over its territory, while the British extracted the country's most valuable natural resource under terms that guaranteed Iranian dependence and British enrichment. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company's growth rate proved exceptional even by the standards of the early petroleum industry. By 1914, the company had constructed the world's largest oil refinery at Abadan, employing over 20,000 workers and processing hundreds of thousands of barrels daily. The British government recognized the company's strategic importance by purchasing a controlling stake, making it the first major government investment in a private oil company. This decision transformed what had begun as a commercial venture into an instrument of British foreign policy. Within 2 decades, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company had become the British Empire's most profitable overseas investment, generating more revenue than entire colonial territories in Africa and Asia. The company's success financed Britain's naval supremacy during World War I and provided the energy resources that powered British industry through the 1920s and 1930s. Iranian oil literally fueled Britain's position as a global superpower, while Iran itself remained economically underdeveloped and politically marginalized. Iranian awareness of this systematic exploitation grew gradually as educated Iranians began to understand the true value of what their country was providing versus what it received in return. Iranian workers at Abadan lived in segregated company housing that was markedly inferior to facilities provided for British employees. Iranian engineers and technicians were excluded from senior positions regardless of their qualifications, while British personnel received salaries 10 times higher for equivalent work. These visible inequalities reinforced the growing perception that the oil arrangement represented economic subjugation. Intellectual and political figures within Iran began questioning the fundamental legitimacy of the concession arrangement by the 1920s. Journalists like Ahmad Khosravi wrote extensively about the disparity between Iran's oil wealth and the country's economic development, while politicians in the Iranian parliament raised concerns about the lack of transparency in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company's financial reporting. Religious leaders also began framing the oil concession in terms of foreign exploitation of Muslim resources, adding a religious dimension to what had initially been purely economic grievances. The company's transformation into the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in 1935 reflected both Iran's name change under Reza Shah Pahlavi and the growing scope of British petroleum operations throughout the country. However, the fundamental structure of the agreement remained unchanged despite Iranian attempts to renegotiate more favorable terms. British officials consistently rejected Iranian proposals for increased revenue sharing, greater operational oversight, or requirements for local hiring and training programs. These early experiences with Western economic exploitation established patterns of Iranian thinking that persist today. The perception that Western powers would use economic agreements to extract Iranian resources while providing minimal benefits in return became deeply embedded in Iranian political culture. The oil concession demonstrated that formal sovereignty meant little if foreign companies controlled a country's most valuable assets under agreements that prevented meaningful Iranian participation or oversight. The Anglo-Iranian oil companies' operations also established the precedent for Western intervention in Iranian domestic politics to protect economic interests. British officials regularly lobbied Iranian government ministers, provided financial incentives to supportive politicians, and threatened economic retaliation against officials who questioned the concession terms. This pattern of using economic leverage to influence Iranian political decisions would become a recurring theme throughout the 20th century. By the 1940s, Iranian resentment toward the oil arrangement had evolved from scattered complaints into organized political opposition. The company's profits during World War II reached unprecedented levels, while Iranian workers faced dangerous working conditions and minimal wage increases. Iranian intellectuals increasingly viewed the oil concession as a symbol of their country's subjugation to foreign economic interests. The irony of Iran's situation became increasingly apparent as other oil-producing regions negotiated more favorable agreements with international companies. While countries like Venezuela and Mexico secured revenue-sharing arrangements approaching 50%, Iran remained locked into a concession that provided less than 20% of profits from its own natural resources. This disparity fueled Iranian determination to eventually assert greater control over their petroleum industry, regardless of British opposition. The foundation laid by the Anglo-Persian oil companies' exploitative practices created the underlying dynamic that would drive Iranian-Western relations for the next century. Iranian leaders learned that Western powers viewed Iran primarily as a source of cheap energy rather than as a sovereign nation deserving of equitable economic partnerships. This lesson would influence Iranian responses to every subsequent Western proposal, creating a cycle of suspicion and mistrust. As global tensions escalated in the late 1930s, Iran's leaders believed they could navigate the coming storm by staying out of foreign conflicts entirely. They would soon discover that possessing the world's most strategic resources made neutrality impossible. When neutrality became impossible, Iran's declaration of neutrality when World War II erupted across Europe appeared reasonable for a nation that had suffered under foreign interference for decades. The country possessed no significant military alliance with either the Axis or Allied powers and had legitimate reasons to avoid entanglement in a conflict that seemed distant from Iranian interests. Reza Shah Pahlavi announced that Iran would remain neutral and focus on internal development rather than choosing sides in what many observers initially expected to be another European war. The Allied powers viewed Iran's neutrality declaration with immediate suspicion and growing alarm as the war's scope expanded. Britain and the Soviet Union recognized that Iran's geographic position made true neutrality essentially impossible once Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June 1941. Iran sat directly between the Soviet Union's vulnerable southern borders and British-controlled territories in the Middle East and India. The country's location meant that Iranian neutrality could either facilitate or prevent crucial supply lines between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union at the moment when Stalin's regime faced the greatest military threat in its history. Reza Shah Pahlavi's modernization programs and political orientation provided additional reasons for Allied concern about Iranian intentions during the war. The Shah had spent the previous 2 decades implementing an aggressive modernization campaign that drew inspiration from European models, including some aspects of fascist organization and efficiency. His admiration for German industrial and military achievements was well known among diplomatic circles, and he had invited German advisors to assist with various development projects throughout the 1930s. German companies had secured significant contracts for railroad construction, industrial development, and technical assistance programs that created substantial German influence within Iran's modernizing economy. The Shah's perceived sympathies toward Nazi Germany extended beyond simple commercial relationships to include ideological elements that worried both British and Soviet officials. German propaganda had found receptive audiences among some Iranian intellectuals who viewed Nazi theories about Aryan racial superiority as validation of Persian historical greatness. German agents had established networks within Iran that promoted anti-British and anti-Soviet sentiment while positioning Germany as a potential ally against traditional imperial powers. Iran's crucial geographic position transformed the country into a strategic prize that neither side could afford to lose once the war expanded beyond Europe. The Persian Gulf provided the most direct route for shipping military supplies from American and British factories to Soviet ports, while Iran's northern borders offered potential access to Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus region that fueled Stalin's war machine. German control over Iran would have severed this vital supply corridor, while simultaneously threatening the oil resources that powered Britain's global military operations. The threat to British oil interests went beyond simple economic considerations to encompass fundamental questions of imperial survival during the war. The Abadan refinery processed more petroleum than any other facility in the British Empire and supplied fuel for military operations from North Africa to the Pacific Theater. German seizure of these facilities would have simultaneously deprived Britain of essential energy resources while providing the Nazi war machine with additional fuel supplies at a critical moment in the conflict. Soviet concerns about Iranian neutrality focused on the possibility of German forces using Iranian territory to launch attacks against vulnerable Soviet positions in Central Asia and the Caucasus. The Soviet Union's southern borders remained lightly defended because Stalin had concentrated most available forces against the German advance through Eastern Europe. German divisions operating from Iranian bases could potentially capture the Baku oil fields that provided much of the Soviet Union's petroleum production, or advance into Central Asia to threaten industrial centers that had been relocated beyond German reach. The Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran began on August 25, 1941, with coordinated attacks from both directions. Vastly outnumbered and ill-equipped, Iran surrendered in days, and Allied forces installed a pliant monarch. British forces advanced from Iraq into southwestern Iran, while Soviet divisions crossed the northern borders simultaneously. The speed of the military defeat demonstrated Iran's complete inability to defend its territory against determined foreign intervention. British and Soviet forces carved Iran into distinct occupation zones with minimal consultation of Iranian authorities. The British established control over southern Iran, including the vital oil installations around Abadan and the Persian Gulf ports needed for supply operations. Soviet forces occupied northern Iran, including the capital Tehran and the industrial centers that had been developed during Reza Shah's modernization programs. This division reflected each power's strategic priorities while reducing Iran to a passive territory under foreign military administration. The forced abdication of Reza Shah Pahlavi eliminated the last symbol of Iranian independence and demonstrated the complete subordination of Iranian sovereignty to Allied military requirements. British and Soviet officials demanded the Shah's removal because they viewed him as unreliable and potentially sympathetic to German interests. They replaced him with his 21-year-old son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who lacked his father's political experience and assertiveness. Over 30,000 U.S. troops used Iran's corridor to funnel crucial supplies to the USSR. American personnel took control of Iran's railroad system, port facilities, and transportation networks to ensure efficient delivery of military aid. The massive American military presence transformed Iran into a crucial Allied logistics hub that operated according to foreign military requirements rather than Iranian national interests. Iranian civilians opposed the occupation through mass protests and political demonstrations that erupted across major cities. Students organized strikes at universities, while merchants closed their shops in acts of civil disobedience. Religious leaders denounced the foreign occupation from mosque pulpits, framing the invasion as an assault on Islamic sovereignty. These expressions of popular resistance were systematically suppressed by Allied forces who viewed Iranian opposition as a threat to their strategic objectives. The wartime occupation convinced many Iranians that their national sovereignty remained conditional on foreign approval, regardless of their government's official policies or international legal rights. The experience of seeing their country divided between foreign armies despite Iran's neutral status created lasting suspicions about Western intentions and commitments to Iranian independence. This lesson would influence Iranian responses to subsequent Western proposals and contribute to the cycle of mistrust that continues to define Iranian-American relations today. The war's end brought hope that foreign armies would withdraw and restore Iranian independence, but the reality proved far more complicated. Britain's determination to maintain control over Iranian oil resources would soon collide with a new generation of Iranian leaders who had witnessed firsthand what foreign domination meant for their country's future. The prime minister who dared to nationalize. Mohammad Mossadegh emerged from the post-war period as the embodiment of Iranian frustration with decades of British economic exploitation. The 70-year-old politician possessed impeccable credentials as a champion of Iranian sovereignty, having earned a law degree from the University of Paris and spent decades advocating for constitutional government and national independence. His aristocratic background provided him with the social standing necessary to challenge foreign powers, while his legal training gave him the technical expertise to understand exactly how the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had structured its operations to maximize British profits at Iranian expense. When he became prime minister in April 1951 through democratic election, Mossadegh represented the culmination of 50 years of growing Iranian awareness that their country's most valuable resource was being systematically stolen by foreign interests. The situation that Mossadegh inherited demonstrated that Allied victory in World War II had changed nothing fundamental about Iran's subordinate economic relationship with Britain. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company continued operating under the same basic terms established in 1909, providing Iran with just 16% of profits, while British shareholders received the remaining 84% from Iranian oil. The company still refused to open its financial records to Iranian auditors or provide detailed accounting of expenses that reduced Iran's share of net profits. Iranian workers remained excluded from senior management positions regardless of their qualifications, while British personnel continued to receive salaries 10 times higher than Iranian workers performing identical tasks. The Iranian parliament's decision to nationalize the oil industry represented one of the most remarkable displays of national unity in the country's modern history. The Majlis voted unanimously to transfer control of all Anglo-Iranian Oil Company assets to the newly created National Iranian Oil Company, with support spanning the entire political spectrum from religious conservatives to secular leftists. This unprecedented consensus reflected the depth of Iranian resentment toward British economic exploitation and the widespread belief that nationalization represented Iran's best opportunity to achieve genuine economic independence. Massive public demonstrations throughout the country celebrated the nationalization decision, with hundreds of thousands of Iranians taking to the streets to express support for Mossadegh's government and its challenge to British dominance. Britain's response to the nationalization exceeded even the most pessimistic Iranian expectations for British retaliation. The British government imposed a comprehensive oil embargo that prevented Iran from selling petroleum to any international buyers, effectively cutting off the revenue source that provided more than 60% of the Iranian government's total budget. Royal Navy warships patrolled the Persian Gulf to intercept any tankers attempting to load Iranian oil, while British diplomatic pressure convinced most major oil companies to refuse contracts with the National Iranian Oil Company. The embargo extended beyond petroleum to include restrictions on other Iranian exports and limitations on international banking services that made it difficult for Iran to conduct foreign trade of any kind. The British campaign to portray Iranian nationalization as theft rather than legitimate exercise of sovereignty proved crucial for building international support for economic pressure against Mossadegh's government. British officials argued that Iran had violated international law by seizing British-owned assets without adequate compensation, framing the dispute as a simple case of nationalization versus property rights rather than a complex issue of colonial exploitation and national sovereignty. This narrative gained traction among Western governments and business communities who worried about the precedent that successful Iranian nationalization might establish for their own overseas investments in developing countries. British diplomatic efforts to isolate Iran internationally achieved significant success as the oil embargo continued into its second year. The United States initially maintained neutrality in the dispute, but gradually moved towards supporting the British position as concerns grew about potential Soviet influence in Iran during the economic crisis. European governments aligned with Britain partly out of alliance solidarity and partly from worry about the implications of successful resource nationalization in their own colonial territories. Iran found itself increasingly isolated diplomatically at precisely the moment when international support was most crucial for breaking the British embargo. The economic hardship created by the oil embargo began undermining popular support for Mossadegh's government as unemployment soared and essential goods became scarce throughout Iran. Government revenues dropped by more than half as oil exports ceased, forcing dramatic cuts in public spending and government employment. Inflation accelerated as the shortage of foreign currency made it difficult to import consumer goods and industrial materials, while the closure of oil facilities eliminated tens of thousands of jobs in the petroleum sector and related industries. The economic crisis particularly affected urban middle-class Iranians who had initially supported nationalization, but now faced unemployment and declining living standards. Internal political divisions within Iran began emerging as the economic situation continued deteriorating without any apparent resolution to the oil crisis. Conservative politicians and religious leaders who had initially supported nationalization began questioning whether the policy was worth the economic suffering it had caused for ordinary Iranians. Military officers grew concerned about the impact of reduced government spending on defense capabilities, while business leaders worried about the long-term consequences of Iran's international isolation. These fractures in the nationalist coalition provided opportunities for foreign intelligence services to exploit Iranian political divisions and build opposition to Mossadegh's continued leadership. Britain's determination to regain control of Iranian oil resources at any cost became increasingly apparent as diplomatic and economic pressure failed to force Mossadegh's capitulation. British officials began exploring more direct forms of intervention, including support for Iranian opposition groups and coordination with foreign intelligence services. The British recognized that successful Iranian nationalization would encourage similar actions by other oil-producing countries, potentially undermining British energy security and economic interests throughout the Middle East and developing world. This strategic concern made compromise impossible from the British perspective and guaranteed continued escalation of the conflict. The oil crisis had created conditions that made direct Western intervention in Iranian politics both possible and attractive to British planners. Economic hardship had weakened public support for Mossadegh's government while creating grievances that could be exploited to build domestic opposition. International isolation had reduced Iran's ability to resist foreign pressure or seek alternative sources of support. Most importantly, the stakes involved in controlling Iranian oil resources were high enough to justify extraordinary measures for regaining British dominance over this crucial strategic asset. By the summer of 1953, British intelligence officials had concluded that only the most drastic action could restore their position in Iran. Operation Ajax, the CIA's first Middle Eastern coup. The CIA and British MI6 transformed this strategic necessity into Operation Ajax, one of the most consequential covert operations in modern history. British intelligence officials approached their American counterparts with a proposal to overthrow Iran's democratically elected government through coordinated subversion and violence. The British had already developed detailed plans for removing Mossadegh from power, but lacked the resources and regional influence necessary to execute the operation successfully. American participation would provide the financial backing, intelligence capabilities, and political cover needed to transform a British revenge scheme into a joint Western intervention that could reshape Iranian politics permanently. The operation required careful presentation to American officials who remained skeptical about direct intervention in Iranian domestic affairs. British intelligence operatives framed the proposed coup as an essential defensive measure against Soviet expansion in the Middle East, rather than an attempt to restore British economic privileges in Iran. They argued that Mossadegh's nationalist government was creating conditions that would inevitably lead to communist takeover, pointing to the Tudeh party's growing influence and the economic crisis that had weakened Iran's ability to resist Soviet pressure. This narrative resonated with American policymakers who viewed the Cold War through the lens of global competition with the Soviet Union and were predisposed to support any action that prevented communist expansion. The specific tactics developed for Operation Ajax demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Iranian political dynamics and social tensions. CIA operatives under the direction of Kermit Roosevelt Jr. established networks of Iranian agents who could organize street demonstrations, distribute propaganda materials, and coordinate with sympathetic military officers. The operation included provisions for bribing key Iranian officials, purchasing the loyalty of tribal leaders, and creating the appearance of widespread popular opposition to Mossadegh's government. Propaganda campaigns portrayed the prime minister as a communist sympathizer who was betraying Iranian religious traditions and national independence to foreign powers. Military officers represented the most crucial component of the coup plan because their participation would provide the force necessary to physically remove Mossadegh from power. CIA operatives identified Iranian military commanders who opposed the prime minister for personal, political, or financial reasons and offered substantial payments for their cooperation. These officers were promised continued American support and enhanced positions within the post-coup government in exchange for their participation in the operation. The conspiracy relied on the assumption that sufficient numbers of Iranian military personnel could be convinced to act against their own government when provided with foreign encouragement and financial incentives. The initial coup attempt on August 15, 1953, collapsed within hours as Iranian security forces loyal to Mossadegh arrested the military officers attempting to deliver the Shah's dismissal decree. The operation's failure appeared complete when the Shah fled Iran for Iraq, convinced that the coup had been definitively defeated and that his own position was untenable. Many CIA operatives prepared to abandon the mission and evacuate Iran, believing that the window for successful intervention had closed permanently. The collapse of the first attempt demonstrated the risks inherent in covert operations and the difficulty of predicting how Iranian political actors would respond to foreign manipulation. The decision to attempt a second coup reflected the enormous stakes involved in the operation's outcome and the CIA's determination to achieve success despite the initial failure. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. convinced his superiors that the situation remained salvageable if the operation could generate sufficient street violence to create the appearance of popular uprising against Mossadegh's government. The revised plan focused on organizing larger demonstrations and provoking confrontations between pro-Shah and pro-Mossadegh crowds that would justify military intervention to restore order. The violent street battles that erupted across Tehran on August 19, 1953, resulted in approximately 300 Iranian deaths, as competing crowds fought for control of key government buildings and strategic locations throughout the city. CIA-funded demonstrators armed with clubs and improvised weapons attacked Mossadegh supporters, while Iranian military units loyal to the coup plotters moved to secure radio stations, government offices, and military installations. The violence escalated throughout the day as both sides called for reinforcements, and the confrontations spread beyond the capital to other Iranian cities. Mossadegh's arrest occurred after loyalist military units defending his residence were overwhelmed by tank units commanded by officers participating in the coup conspiracy. The prime minister's capture marked the definitive success of the operation and eliminated the primary obstacle to restoring the Shah's authority. The arrest was followed by a systematic roundup of Mossadegh supporters throughout the government, military, and civil society organizations. This purge ensured that potential opposition to the new regime would be eliminated before it could organize effective resistance to the coup's results. The restoration of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power included provisions for greatly expanded authority that transformed Iran's constitutional monarchy into an increasingly authoritarian system. The Shah returned from exile with American assurances of continued support and British agreement to resume oil operations under new terms. His enhanced powers included direct control over military appointments, expanded security services, and reduced parliamentary oversight of government decisions. The immediate restoration of Western oil companies to Iranian operations occurred under terms that were more favorable to Iran than the original British concession, but still maintained foreign control over the country's petroleum resources. The new consortium agreement provided Iran with 50% of oil profits, while American companies secured 40% of the remaining share. However, Western companies retained operational control of Iranian oil facilities and continued to exclude Iranians from senior management positions within the industry. Operation Ajax established the template for future CIA interventions throughout the developing world during the Cold War period. The operation's success demonstrated that covert action could achieve regime change objectives without the political costs associated with direct military intervention. The coup's success remained classified for more than 2 decades, allowing the United States to maintain its image as a supporter of democracy, while secretly celebrating one of intelligence history's most successful operations. The restored Shah would now face the challenge of rebuilding his legitimacy, while managing Iran's complex relationship with his American benefactors. American military assistance transformed Iran into the most heavily armed nation in the Middle East within a decade of the Shah's restoration to power. The Pentagon established permanent advisory missions throughout Iran that provided training, equipment, and strategic guidance to Iranian officers at every command level. Military aid packages included advanced F-14 Tomcat fighters, sophisticated radar systems, modern chieftain tanks, and naval vessels that elevated Iran's capabilities from a regional force into one of the most powerful armies in the developing world. This assistance exceeded American military aid to most NATO allies and reflected Washington's assessment that Iranian security was essential to containing Soviet expansion in the region. Iran's geographic position made the country an irreplaceable buffer against Soviet access to the oil-rich Persian Gulf and broader Middle East. American strategists understood that Soviet control over Iran would provide Moscow with warm water ports, proximity to crucial shipping lanes, and potential bases for projecting power throughout the region. The Iranian military buildup served multiple objectives by deterring Soviet aggression, protecting Western oil interests, and maintaining regional stability under American leadership. Iranian forces also provided a potential staging area for American operations should direct confrontation with the Soviet Union become necessary. The Shah's establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel created one of the most controversial aspects of the Iranian-American alliance, while demonstrating Iran's complete alignment with American regional policies. Iran became the first Muslim-majority country to recognize Israel diplomatically and maintained extensive trade relationships despite intense criticism from other Islamic nations. This partnership included Iranian oil exports to Israel, intelligence cooperation between security services, and coordination on regional issues. The Iranian-Israeli relationship served American interests by creating a network of pro-Western allies that could counter Soviet influence and Arab nationalism throughout the Middle East. American support enabled the Shah's ambitious white revolution that sought to transform Iran into a developed Western-style society within a generation. Land reform initiatives, women's suffrage, literacy campaigns, and industrial development projects received substantial American financial and technical assistance. American companies secured major contracts for infrastructure development, industrial construction, and technology transfer programs that created thousands of jobs for American workers while modernizing Iranian society. These programs reflected American confidence that rapid modernization would create a stable, prosperous ally that could serve as a model for other developing countries. The creation of SAVAK represented the darkest aspect of Iranian-American cooperation, as the CIA provided training, equipment, and operational guidance for the Shah's secret police organization. American intelligence officers taught SAVAK personnel surveillance techniques, interrogation methods, and counterintelligence operations that enabled systematic monitoring and suppression of political opposition throughout Iran. SAVAK's network of informants, safe houses, and detention facilities encompassed every aspect of Iranian society, from universities and labor unions to religious organizations and government ministries. The organization's torture methods and human rights violations were facilitated by American training and equipment that enabled widespread repression of the Shah's opponents. Iran's emergence as a major purchaser of American military technology created substantial benefits for defense contractors, while building one of the world's most sophisticated conventional military forces. Iranian orders for advanced fighter aircraft, missile systems, and naval vessels provided billions of dollars in revenue for American companies, while creating thousands of manufacturing jobs in key congressional districts. The Shah's military spending averaged over 10% of Iran's gross domestic product during the 1970s, making Iran one of the world's largest arms importers and America's most valuable military customer outside NATO. This relationship included technology transfer agreements that established Iranian production facilities for American weapon systems. The economic boom generated by oil revenues and American investment created unprecedented prosperity for Iran's urban middle class, while transforming major cities into showcases of modern development. Tehran's population doubled during the 1960s and 1970s as rural migrants sought opportunities in expanding industrial and service sectors. New universities, hospitals, shopping centers, and residential developments changed the physical landscape of Iranian cities while creating a Western-educated professional class that supported the Shah's modernization agenda. American companies established regional headquarters in Tehran that served markets throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Rural areas and traditional communities remained largely excluded from modernization benefits, despite comprising the majority of Iran's population. Agricultural reforms redistributed land from large estates to small farmers, but failed to provide the credit, technology, or market access necessary for successful operations. Rural-urban income disparities widened dramatically as oil revenues funded urban development, while rural infrastructure remained underdeveloped. Traditional craft industries declined as imported manufactured goods displaced local production, causing unemployment and economic disruption in smaller cities and rural communities. The Shah's close identification with American policies created widespread perceptions that Iran had become a client state rather than an independent nation. American advisors played prominent roles in Iranian government ministries, military commands, and economic planning agencies that raised questions about Iranian sovereignty and decision-making autonomy. The conspicuous presence of American personnel, businesses, and cultural influences throughout Iranian society reinforced impressions that the Shah governed on behalf of foreign interests rather than the Iranian people. Opposition groups regularly characterized the Shah as an American puppet whose policies served Washington's agenda rather than Iranian national interests. The contradiction between Iran's military strength and political legitimacy became increasingly apparent as the Shah's authoritarian rule prevented meaningful political participation, while his pro-Western orientation alienated traditional and religious constituencies. Modernization programs challenged established social structures and cultural values without providing mechanisms for popular input or democratic participation. Economic inequality, social disruption, and political repression created grievances that impressive military capabilities could not address through force alone. The alliance with America provided external security and economic benefits, but ultimately undermined the domestic support necessary for long-term stability. By the late 1970s, these accumulated tensions had reached a breaking point that would soon explode across Iran in ways that would shock both the Shah and his American patrons. The revolution that shocked the world. Millions of Iranians poured into the streets throughout 1978 in what became the largest popular uprising in the country's modern history. The demonstrations began with relatively small gatherings in religious cities like Qom and Mashhad, but rapidly spread to every major urban center, as grievances that had accumulated over decades of authoritarian rule finally erupted into mass protest. Tehran alone witnessed demonstrations involving over 1 million participants on multiple occasions, while cities across the country saw their normal routines completely disrupted by strikes, marches, and civil disobedience campaigns. The sheer scale of participation demonstrated that opposition to the Shah's government had penetrated every segment of Iranian society and could no longer be contained through traditional methods of political control. The revolutionary coalition that emerged represented an unprecedented alliance between groups that had previously viewed each other with suspicion or outright hostility. Religious conservatives who opposed the Shah's secularization policies found themselves marching alongside leftist students who criticized his capitalist economic system and authoritarian political structure. middle-class professionals who had initially benefited from the Shah's modernization programs joined the protests as economic problems and political repression affected their daily lives. Labor unions, merchant associations, university students, and government employees participated in coordinated strikes that paralyzed the country's economy and demonstrated the breadth of opposition to continued royal rule. The Cinema Rex fire in Abadan became a pivotal moment that transformed scattered protests into a unified revolutionary movement. The tragedy killed at least 420 people who had been trapped inside the burning theater, creating one of the deadliest incidents in Iranian history. The Shah's regime attributed the fire to Marxist and Islamist insurgents, attempting to deflect blame and maintain control. However, many protesters and opposition groups believed the Shah's secret police, the SAVAK, were responsible, viewing it as a deliberate act of violence against the populace. This event significantly fueled public anger, distrust, and resentment towards the Shah's government, serving as a powerful symbol of the regime's alleged brutality and disregard for human life. Black Friday marked the point of no return for the Shah's government as his military forces opened fire on unarmed demonstrators in Tehran's JCPOA Square on September 8, 1978. The massacre resulted in hundreds of casualties as soldiers used automatic weapons against crowds that included women, children, and elderly participants. The indiscriminate violence demonstrated the regime's willingness to use lethal force against its own citizens, eroding any remaining public trust and pushing the revolution towards its final stages. The bloodshed at JCPOA Square convinced many Iranians that peaceful reform was impossible and that only complete removal of the Shah's government could end the cycle of violence and repression. Military defections accelerated dramatically following the Black Friday massacre as Iranian soldiers and officers began questioning orders to fire on their own people. The Shah's inability to maintain military loyalty became increasingly apparent as entire units refused deployment orders or simply abandoned their posts rather than participate in suppressing demonstrations. Senior commanders found themselves unable to rely on their subordinates to carry out crowd control operations, while enlisted personnel faced impossible choices between following orders and protecting civilian protesters who included their own family members and neighbors. The erosion of military discipline represented a fundamental breakdown of the coercive apparatus that had sustained the Shah's rule for over 2 decades. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini emerged as the revolution's spiritual leader despite spending 15 years in exile in Iraq and France. His recorded speeches and written statements circulated throughout Iran via cassette tapes and underground publications that evaded government censorship. Khomeini's message resonated with Iranian audiences because he combined religious authority with political opposition to the Shah's secular modernization programs and pro-Western orientation. His years of exile had transformed him into a symbol of resistance against foreign domination and governmental corruption, while his religious credentials provided legitimacy among conservative Iranians who viewed the revolution in terms of Islamic revival rather than purely political change. The Shah's final departure from Iran on January 16, 1979, marked the definitive collapse of the Pahlavi dynasty and the end of America's most important Middle Eastern alliance. Recognizing the untenable nature of his position, the Shah fled the country amid massive demonstrations and complete breakdown of governmental authority. His departure created a power vacuum that revolutionary forces were prepared to fill through the network of opposition organizations that had emerged during the uprising. The royal family's evacuation eliminated the last symbol of continuity with the old regime and cleared the way for fundamental transformation of Iran's political system. Khomeini's return to Iran on February 1, 1979, after 15 years in exile, resolved the factional competition in favor of Islamic governance. His arrival drew millions of supporters to Tehran streets in what became one of the largest public gatherings in Iranian history. The new radical Shiite Islamist government immediately abolished the monarchy and began implementing religious law throughout the country. Khomeini's establishment of the Islamic Republic fundamentally transformed Iran from America's closest Middle Eastern ally into its greatest regional enemy, creating a theological state that viewed the United States as the embodiment of Western corruption and imperialism. The new regime's systematic persecution of former American allies within Iran demonstrated the complete reversal of the country's international orientation. Mass executions and purges targeted political opponents and members of the former regime who had maintained relationships with American government officials or business interests. Military officers who had received training in the United States faced particular scrutiny, while Iranian civilians who had worked for American companies or cultural organizations found themselves under suspicion of collaboration with foreign enemies. The revolution's transformation of Iran from a pro-Western monarchy to a vehemently anti-American Islamic theocracy created one of the most dramatic geopolitical reversals of the 20th century. Within months, the United States had lost its most reliable regional ally and gained an ideological enemy committed to challenging American influence throughout the Middle East. The new Iranian leadership's hostility toward America would soon manifest in ways that shocked the world and established patterns of confrontation that persist today. American policymakers faced the challenge of responding to a regime that viewed any gesture of accommodation as weakness and interpreted humanitarian actions as hostile provocations. 444 days that defined decades of hostility. The Carter administration's decision to admit the exiled Shah into the United States for cancer treatment in October 1979 represented a humanitarian gesture that Iranian revolutionaries interpreted as a calculated act of American aggression. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had been living in exile since fleeing Iran during the revolution, moving between Egypt, Morocco, and the Bahamas while seeking medical treatment for his terminal lymphoma. American officials initially resisted pressure to provide the Shah with medical care, recognizing that his presence on American soil would inflame tensions with Iran's new Islamic government. However, the Shah's deteriorating health condition and lobbying by former American officials who had worked with his regime eventually convinced President Carter to authorize his admission to New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center for specialized cancer treatment. Iranian revolutionary leaders viewed the Shah's arrival in America as confirmation of their deepest suspicions about continued American interference in Iranian affairs. The timing appeared particularly provocative because it occurred just months after the Islamic Republic's establishment and during a period of intense internal political consolidation. Revolutionary authorities demanded the Shah's immediate extradition to Iran to face trial for alleged crimes against the Iranian people, including human rights violations, corruption, and collaboration with foreign powers. The American refusal to consider extradition reinforced Iranian perceptions that the United States remained committed to protecting the former monarch and potentially restoring him to power through another CIA-orchestrated coup similar to Operation Ajax in 1953. Iranian students, calling themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, stormed the American embassy compound in Tehran on November 4, 1979, capturing 52 American diplomats, Marines, and civilian personnel in an operation that would transform international relations for decades. The student revolutionaries had planned their assault carefully, coordinating with sympathetic security forces to overcome embassy defenses and secure the entire compound within hours. The attackers bound and blindfolded their captives before declaring that the hostages would not be released until the United States extradited the Shah to face revolutionary justice in Iran. The embassy seizure represented an unprecedented violation of diplomatic immunity that shocked the international community and marked a complete breakdown in Iranian-American relations. The revolutionary government's decision to endorse and support the embassy takeover demonstrated the radical nature of Iran's new leadership and their commitment to confronting American influence in the region. Ayatollah Khomeini publicly praised the student action and declared that the embassy had served as a den of spies that threatened Iranian sovereignty and Islamic revolution. Government officials justified the hostage-taking as a legitimate response to decades of American interference in Iranian politics, citing the 1953 coup and continued support for the Shah's authoritarian regime as evidence of American hostility toward Iranian independence. The crisis provided revolutionary leaders with a powerful tool for mobilizing domestic support while demonstrating their willingness to challenge American power regardless of international consequences. Operation Eagle Claw represented the Carter administration's attempt to resolve the hostage crisis through military force when diplomatic efforts failed to achieve meaningful progress. The complex rescue mission, launched on April 24, 1980, involved 8 helicopters flying from aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf to a remote staging area in the Iranian desert where they would refuel before proceeding to Tehran. The operation required precise coordination between multiple military units and depended on maintaining complete secrecy to avoid detection by Iranian forces. However, the mission encountered mechanical failures and severe weather conditions that forced commanders to abort the rescue attempt before reaching the embassy compound. The tragic conclusion of Operation Eagle Claw occurred when a helicopter collided with a transport aircraft during the evacuation from the desert staging area, killing 8 American servicemen and destroying both aircraft. The accident left classified documents and equipment scattered across the Iranian desert, providing revolutionary authorities with detailed intelligence about American military capabilities and operational planning. Iranian officials displayed the wreckage and captured materials as evidence of American aggression while using the failed mission as propaganda to demonstrate the revolution's ability to resist foreign intervention. The operation's failure severely damaged Carter's presidency and reinforced Iranian confidence in their ability to defy American power. The hostage crisis dominated American television news coverage and political discourse throughout 1980 as media outlets provided daily updates on the captives' condition and diplomatic efforts to secure their release. Television networks began ending their evening news broadcasts with countdowns of the number of days the hostages had been held, creating constant public awareness of the crisis and mounting pressure on the Carter administration to achieve resolution. The prolonged captivity of American citizens generated intense public anger toward Iran and demands for military retaliation, while also highlighting the limitations of American power in confronting revolutionary movements. Multiple diplomatic initiatives attempted to resolve the hostage crisis through third-party mediation and negotiated settlements that would satisfy both Iranian demands and American interests. Algeria emerged as the primary intermediary between the two governments, hosting secret negotiations and proposing compromise solutions that could facilitate the hostages' release. The Algerian government's efforts included detailed discussions about unfreezing Iranian assets, lifting economic sanctions, and providing guarantees against future American interference in Iranian affairs. These negotiations proved extremely complex because they required resolving fundamental disagreements about sovereignty, justice, and international law while addressing domestic political pressures in both countries. The hostages' release on January 20, 1981, coincided precisely with Ronald Reagan's presidential inauguration in a carefully orchestrated arrangement that reflected Iranian determination to deny Carter any political credit for resolving the crisis. The Algiers Accords that secured their freedom included American agreements to unfreeze approximately $12 billion in Iranian assets, lift trade sanctions, and establish an international tribunal to resolve outstanding financial claims between the two countries. The agreement also included American promises not to interfere in Iranian internal affairs, though this provision proved impossible to verify or enforce in practice. The 444-day hostage crisis created permanent damage to American perceptions of Iran that continues to influence bilateral relations more than 4 decades later. The prolonged captivity of American citizens generated deep public resentment toward Iran while establishing precedents for economic sanctions and diplomatic isolation that became standard elements of American policy toward the Islamic Republic. The crisis also demonstrated that revolutionary movements could successfully challenge American power through asymmetric tactics, encouraging other anti-American groups worldwide to adopt similar strategies. Most significantly, the hostage crisis resulted in the complete severing of diplomatic relations between Washington and Tehran that persist today, eliminating normal channels for communication and crisis resolution between two countries whose conflicts continue threatening regional stability. as Iran's revolutionary government consolidated power through this confrontation with America. Regional leaders began calculating whether the Islamic Republic's apparent weakness might present opportunities that changed for territorial expansion. Saddam Hussein's calculation in September 1980 that Iran's revolutionary upheaval had created an unprecedented window of opportunity for Iraqi expansion proved to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in modern Middle Eastern history. The Iraqi dictator observed the chaos consuming Iran's military and political institutions following the Islamic Revolution and concluded that Iran's armed forces were too disorganized and demoralized to mount effective resistance against a determined Iraqi assault. Hussein believed that Iran's purges of experienced military officers, ongoing political instability, and international isolation had rendered the country vulnerable to swift conquest. His strategic objective extended beyond simple territorial acquisition to encompass replacing Iran as the dominant power in the Persian Gulf region while positioning Iraq as the undisputed leader of the Arab world. The massive Iraqi invasion launched on September 22, 1980, initially achieved stunning success as armored divisions crossed the Shatt al-Arab waterway and advanced rapidly into Iran's oil-rich Khuzestan province. Iraqi forces captured key cities including Khorramshahr and Abadan while advancing toward the strategic port of Awaz that served as the economic heart of Iran's petroleum industry. The invasion force included over 100,000 troops supported by hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft that overwhelmed Iranian border defenses within the first week of fighting. Hussein's forces controlled approximately 10,000 square miles of Iranian territory by October 1980, including crucial oil installations that provided Iran with much of its export revenue. The war's impact on Iran's military capabilities forced the Islamic Republic to simultaneously rebuild its armed forces while fighting for national survival against a well-equipped enemy. The revolutionary government faced the enormous challenge of replacing the Shah's military leadership while maintaining combat effectiveness against Iraqi forces that possessed superior equipment and training. Iranian commanders had to integrate Revolutionary Guards, regular army units, and volunteer militias into coherent fighting forces capable of conducting complex military operations. The process required improvisation and adaptation as Iran's military doctrine evolved to compensate for equipment shortages and the loss of American technical support that had previously maintained Iranian weapon systems. American support for Iraq throughout the conflict included intelligence sharing, weapons sales, and diplomatic backing that significantly enhanced Iraqi military capabilities while prolonging the war's duration. The Reagan administration provided Iraq with satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and tactical intelligence that allowed Iraqi forces to target Iranian military positions and supply lines more effectively. American companies sold dual-use technology to Iraq that could be converted for military purposes, while the United States removed Iraq from its list of state sponsors of terrorism to facilitate arms transfers. This support continued even after American intelligence agencies confirmed that Iraqi forces were using chemical weapons against Iranian troops and civilian populations. The conflict's escalation to include systematic attacks on civilian targets and the use of chemical weapons transformed what had begun as a conventional territorial dispute into one of the 20th century's most brutal wars. Iraqi aircraft and missiles targeted Iranian cities, including Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz in campaigns designed to terrorize civilian populations and undermine support for the war effort. Iraq's deployment of mustard gas, nerve agents, and other chemical weapons against Iranian positions violated international law, while causing thousands of casualties among Iranian forces who lacked adequate protective equipment. The chemical attacks proved particularly devastating because Iranian troops often had no warning of their deployment and limited means of medical treatment for exposure victims. The human wave attacks employed by Iranian forces against Iraqi defensive positions created scenes of carnage reminiscent of World War I's Western Front battlefields. Iranian commanders ordered tens of thousands of volunteers, including teenagers and elderly men, to advance across minefields and through machine gun fire to overwhelm Iraqi positions through sheer numbers. These tactics reflected Iran's manpower advantages and willingness to accept massive casualties to achieve tactical objectives. But they also demonstrated the desperation of Iranian military planning. The trench warfare that characterized much of the conflict included elaborate defensive systems, poison gas attacks, and artillery bombardments that recalled the static battles of 1916 and 1917. The siege mentality, created by 8 years of warfare against an internationally supported enemy, actually strengthened the Islamic Republic by providing revolutionary leaders with external justification for internal repression and mobilization. The war enabled Iranian authorities to suppress domestic opposition by characterizing critics as traitors who were undermining national defense during a time of existential threat. Revolutionary institutions used wartime conditions to consolidate control over Iranian society while building popular support through appeals to patriotism and religious duty. International arms sales to both Iran and Iraq prolonged the conflict by ensuring that neither side could achieve decisive military superiority despite enormous casualties and economic devastation. European countries, Soviet bloc nations, and various Third World suppliers provided weapons to both combatants while maintaining official neutrality in the conflict. These sales included advanced aircraft missile systems and artillery that replaced battlefield losses and enabled continued fighting for years beyond what either country could have sustained independently. The human cost of the 8-year conflict reached staggering proportions as casualty figures approached those of major 20th-century wars despite the relatively limited geographic scope of fighting. Estimates suggest that Iran suffered between 250,000 and 400,000 deaths during the conflict, while Iraqi casualties ranged from 250,000 to 500,000 killed. The use of chemical weapons and extensive minefields contributed significantly to these casualty figures, as did the human wave tactics that characterized much of the fighting. Hundreds of thousands of additional combatants and civilians suffered permanent injuries from conventional weapons, chemical exposure, and psychological trauma that affected both societies for decades after the war's conclusion. American support for Iraq during this devastating conflict created enduring Iranian mistrust of the United States that continues to influence bilateral relations today. Iranian leaders viewed American assistance to Hussein's regime as evidence of continued American hostility toward the Islamic Republic and determination to destroy Iran's revolutionary government through proxy warfare. This 8-year experience convinced Iranian leadership that only military strength and strategic deterrence could protect Iran from future American-sponsored aggression. As the war dragged toward its conclusion, Iran's vulnerability to international pressure would become even more apparent when the conflict expanded beyond land battles to threaten global commerce itself. From tanker war to nuclear ambitions, the escalation of attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf during the final years of the Iran-Iraq War transformed a regional conflict into a global crisis that threatened international commerce and energy security. Both Iran and Iraq began targeting merchant vessels carrying petroleum exports in 1984 as each side attempted to strangle the other's economy by disrupting oil revenues that funded their war efforts. Iranian forces used speedboats, mines, and missile attacks to strike tankers serving Iraqi ports or carrying oil from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, countries that provided financial support to Hussein's regime. The attacks created a climate of terror among international shipping companies, while driving up insurance rates and oil prices worldwide, as the global economy faced potential disruption of Persian Gulf petroleum supplies that provided nearly 40% of the world's oil exports. Iranian naval forces intensified their tanker attacks throughout 1987 and early 1988 as the war with Iraq reached its final phase, and both sides desperately sought military advantages that could force a favorable peace settlement. Iranian Revolutionary Guard speedboats launched surprise attacks against Kuwaiti tankers, while Iranian forces deployed naval mines throughout shipping channels that connected oil terminals to international waters. These operations aimed to demonstrate Iran's ability to close the Persian Gulf to commercial traffic if Western powers continued supporting Iraq's war effort. The mining campaign proved particularly effective because it created psychological pressure on ship captains and insurance companies even when actual attacks were relatively infrequent. Operation Praying Mantis represented the largest American naval combat operation since World War II and demonstrated overwhelming American military superiority over Iranian forces in the Persian Gulf. The operation launched on April 18, 1988, after the USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine that tore a 15-foot hole in the frigate's hull and nearly sank the vessel. American retaliation included coordinated strikes against Iranian oil platforms, naval bases, and warships that destroyed half of Iran's operational fleet within a single day. The scale and precision of American attacks shocked Iranian military leaders who had underestimated American resolve and capabilities while overestimating their own ability to challenge American naval power in the Persian Gulf. The destruction of Iranian naval capabilities during Operation Praying Mantis included the sinking of the Iranian frigate Sahand, severe damage to the frigate Savalon, and the complete destruction of multiple Iranian speedboats and patrol craft that had conducted the tanker attacks. American forces destroyed two major Iranian oil platforms that served as military bases, while demonstrating their ability to strike Iranian targets throughout the Persian Gulf with minimal American casualties. The operation resulted in the deaths of 56 Iranian military personnel, while only 2 Americans died in a helicopter accident unrelated to combat operations. The overwhelming disparity in casualties and equipment losses demonstrated the futility of conventional Iranian military resistance against American forces. The tragic shoot-down of Iran Air Flight 655 by the USS Vincennes on July 3, 1988, created one of the most enduring sources of Iranian resentment toward the United States and permanently damaged American credibility in the region. The American cruiser fired surface-to-air missiles at the civilian Airbus A300 aircraft while it flew over Iranian territorial waters on a regularly scheduled commercial flight between Tehran and Dubai. All 290 passengers and crew members died in the attack, including 66 children who were traveling with their families during the summer vacation season. American officials initially claimed that Iran Air Flight 655 was an attacking military aircraft that had ignored radio warnings, but investigators later determined that the civilian airliner had been following standard flight procedures while broadcasting appropriate identification signals on international aviation frequencies. The end of the Iran-Iraq War in August 1988 left Iran with a devastated economy, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and a bitter determination never again to face military vulnerability against foreign enemies. Iranian leaders recognized that their country's conventional military forces had proved inadequate against Iraqi forces equipped with Western weapons and intelligence support. The 8-year conflict had demonstrated that Iran could not rely on international law, United Nations resolutions, or appeals to justice when facing enemies supported by major powers. The war's conclusion forced Iranian strategic planners to develop new approaches to national defense that could compensate for Iran's conventional military weaknesses. The Gulf War in 1991 provided Iranian observers with a devastating demonstration of American military dominance that reinforced their conclusions about the need for asymmetric defense capabilities. American forces destroyed Iraqi military capabilities within weeks through precision bombing campaigns and advanced technology that rendered traditional military tactics obsolete. The speed and completeness of American victory over the same Iraqi forces that had fought Iran for 8 years shocked Iranian military analysts, who realized that conventional resistance against American power was impossible. The Gulf War demonstrated that the United States possessed the capability to destroy any Middle Eastern military force that challenged American interests through direct confrontation. Iran's response to these lessons included the systematic development of asymmetric warfare capabilities that could deter American attack while avoiding direct military confrontation that Iran could not win. Iranian planners focused on building proxy relationships with non-state actors throughout the Middle East who could threaten American allies and interests without providing clear targets for American retaliation. The development of ballistic missile technology provided Iran with the ability to strike American bases and allied countries throughout the region while remaining beyond the range of immediate American response. The beginning of Iran's nuclear program during the 1990s represented the logical conclusion of Iranian strategic thinking about deterrence and survival in a hostile international environment. Iranian leaders viewed nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantee against foreign aggression and the only reliable method for ensuring national independence. American sanctions against Iran increased throughout the 1990s as the United States attempted to pressure Iran into abandoning its nuclear program and ending support for regional proxy forces. These sanctions created economic hardship while reinforcing Iranian perceptions that the United States sought to weaken and ultimately destroy the Islamic Republic through economic warfare. The combination of military humiliation, economic pressure, and regional threats convinced Iranian leadership that nuclear weapons represented their only reliable guarantee of national survival and independence in an international system dominated by American power. By the early 2000s, Iran's nuclear ambitions would soon attract international attention in ways that would transform the Islamic Republic from a regional concern into a global threat. The nuclear crisis and modern confrontation. The revelation of Iran's secret nuclear facilities in 2002 sent shockwaves through the international community and marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase in American-Iranian relations. Iranian opposition groups disclosed the existence of previously unknown uranium enrichment facilities at Natanz and a heavy water reactor under construction at Iraq that had been built without International Atomic Energy Agency oversight or approval. These discoveries proved that Iran had been conducting clandestine nuclear activities for nearly 2 decades, while publicly claiming its nuclear program served only peaceful purposes. The scale and sophistication of the hidden facilities demonstrated Iran's determination to develop nuclear capabilities despite international sanctions and diplomatic pressure. President George W. Bush's inclusion of Iran in the axis of evil during his January 2002 State of the Union address fundamentally altered Iranian calculations about nuclear weapons development and regional security. Bush's speech grouped Iran with Iraq and North Korea as nations that posed existential threats to American interests through their pursuit of weapons of mass destruction and support for international terrorism. The designation came just months after Iranian cooperation with American forces during the invasion of Afghanistan, ending secret diplomatic channels that had shown promise for improving bilateral relations. Iranian leaders interpreted the axis of evil speech as confirmation that the United States viewed the Islamic Republic as an enemy that would eventually face American military action regardless of Iranian behavior. The American invasion of Iraq in March 2003 provided Iranian strategists with a terrifying preview of what awaited nations that lacked nuclear deterrent capabilities when they conflicted with American interests. The swift destruction of Saddam Hussein's conventional military forces demonstrated that even well-equipped regional armies could not resist American technological superiority and precision warfare capabilities. Iranian officials observed that Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction programs had been used to justify the invasion, while North Korea's actual nuclear weapons had provided that country with immunity from American attack. The lesson appeared clear to Iranian leadership that nuclear weapons represented the only reliable guarantee against American military intervention. The acceleration of Iran's nuclear program following the Iraq invasion reflected the regime's conviction that survival required nuclear deterrent capabilities as quickly as possible. Iranian engineers rapidly expanded uranium enrichment activities at Natanz while beginning construction of additional facilities that could support a comprehensive nuclear weapons program. The Islamic Republic also initiated development of ballistic missile systems capable of delivering nuclear warheads to targets throughout the Middle East and beyond. These parallel programs created the technical foundation for nuclear weapons production while providing Iran with negotiating leverage in diplomatic efforts. International negotiations to limit Iran's nuclear program consumed more than a decade as the United States, European Union, Russia, and China attempted to find diplomatic solutions that would satisfy Iranian security concerns while preventing nuclear weapons proliferation. The complexity of these discussions reflected fundamental disagreements about Iran's right to nuclear technology, the scope of international oversight required, and the relationship between sanctions relief and nuclear restrictions. Multiple rounds of talks collapsed over Iranian insistence on maintaining enrichment capabilities versus Western demands for complete suspension of all nuclear activities that could contribute to weapons development. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action signed in 2015 represented the most significant diplomatic achievement in American-Iranian relations since the 1979 revolution. The agreement required Iran to reduce its uranium stockpiles by 98%, limit enrichment to levels far below weapons-grade concentrations, and accept unprecedented international monitoring of its nuclear facilities. In exchange, the United States and international community agreed to lift sanctions that had crippled Iran's economy while providing the Islamic Republic with access to frozen assets worth over $100 billion. The deal increased Iran's theoretical breakout time for nuclear weapons development from weeks to approximately 1 year. President Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear agreement in May 2018 shattered the diplomatic framework that had prevented Iranian nuclear weapons development while imposing the harshest economic sanctions in the country's history. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign aimed to force Iran into negotiations for a more comprehensive agreement that would address ballistic missile development and regional proxy activities in addition to nuclear issues. However, Iranian leaders viewed the American withdrawal as evidence that the United States could not be trusted to honor diplomatic commitments, making future negotiations significantly more difficult to achieve. Iran's systematic violation of nuclear deal restrictions following American withdrawal demonstrated the Islamic Republic's determination to use nuclear leverage for political and economic concessions. Iranian engineers began enriching uranium to 20% concentration while accumulating stockpiles that exceeded agreement limits by more than 10 times. The country also resumed development of advanced centrifuge technology that could dramatically reduce the time required for weapons-grade uranium production. These violations created international pressure for renewed diplomatic engagement while raising alarms about Iran's proximity to nuclear weapons capability. The assassination of Qasem Soleimani at Baghdad International Airport on January 3, 2020, brought the United States and Iran closer to full-scale warfare than at any point since the 1979 revolution. The targeted killing of Iran's most important military commander represented an unprecedented escalation that Iranian leaders could not ignore without appearing weak to domestic and regional audiences. Iran's missile retaliation against American bases in Iraq marked the first direct Iranian military attack on American forces since the 1979 revolution and came within hours of triggering broader conflict between the two countries. Recent developments in 2025 have demonstrated that the nuclear crisis remains unresolved and potentially more dangerous than ever before. Iran has advanced its uranium enrichment to 60% concentration, just steps away from the 90% level required for nuclear weapons production. Iranian officials have begun making explicit threats about nuclear weapons development, while military commanders allegedly recommend preemptive strikes against American bases in the region. These escalating tensions reveal how decades of accumulated grievances and strategic miscalculations have created a confrontation that extends far beyond the immediate nuclear issue to encompass fundamental questions about power, sovereignty, and survival in the modern Middle East. This confrontation between Washington and Tehran represents more than political disagreement between two governments. These mutual grievances have created institutional mistrust that survives changes in leadership and transcends individual policy decisions. Each nation views the other's defensive preparations as aggressive threats requiring countermeasures that appear equally threatening from the opposite perspective. This cycle has produced a dangerous spiral where diplomatic solutions become increasingly difficult, while military confrontation remains a constant possibility. The Iranian-American rivalry continues shaping Middle Eastern politics today, with both countries maintaining the military capabilities necessary to transform their cold conflict into the devastating regional war they have narrowly avoided multiple times since 1979.